Hello. I think that we can get started, and welcome all of you on today's last panel devoted to the issue of collective memory of survival strategies related to the hunger and food shortages crisis of the past. And during this session, we will have the opportunity to listen 4 presentations. First of them will be delivered online by Irina Skubi, and third of papers will be given on site. And I would like to inform you that we have a small change. Unfortunately, Irina Skubi has to leave early, so she won't be able to take part in the open discussion. We are very sorry because of that. But as an organizer and a moderator of this session, I would like to thank Irina for being with us now and for a very interesting and thought-provoking paper that I have already had the opportunity to read. And according to the schedule, we have 2 hours and 50 minutes. So it means that there will be around 30 minutes discussion after presentations. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, previously mentioned Irina Skubi, who is the historian of Ukraine and Soviet Union, and she earned a candidate of sciences degree in history from Kharkiv National University in 2013, and she's a PhD candidate in history at Queen's University in Canada. Her research explores consumptions, practices, materialities of survival, and human-nature relationship during the Soviet famines in Ukraine. And in her today presentation, she will also refer to all of these issues as she presents the paper entitled Beyond Soviet Modernity, Famines, Ecology, Environment, and Survival in Ukraine. Irina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this introduction. It's very generous of you, and thank you for inviting me to this panel and to this event. And I'm very happy to be here with you, though online. And thank you for providing the opportunity to join you virtually. I think it's great to continue this discussion following the previous panel and interesting presentations. And in my presentation today, as you see from the slide, I'm going to focus on practices of survival related to environment, and we'll discuss famine ecology based on cases of Ukrainian famines during the Soviet history. And as you can see from the image on the slide, it is a photograph of a burdock, a plant that I took this summer in Kingston, in Canada. And as you know, it's a wheat plant, and it is common in Ukraine, Europe, and Canada. And this very plant became a crucial part of the history of human survival during the famines in Ukraine. And this plant opens a possibility to talk about a human-environmental relationship during the times of extremes, and specifically the Soviet famines, and how all of these ideas are related to the understanding of the Soviet history and the concepts of the so-called Soviet modernity. So I'm beginning this presentation with this plant, and I'm going to end my presentation with this plant in the end of my talk. And I guess it's not necessary now to provide a very long overview about the history of Soviet famines in Ukraine, as those famines have already been mentioned. But I just would like to point out that I'm focusing here on the cases of 3 Soviet famines in Ukraine, as that one followed the First World War in the early 20s. The second one was during collectivization, known as the Holodomor in 1932-33. And the third famine followed the Second World War, famine of 1946-47. And in my research, I also would like to focus largely, not specifically on the objects of survival per se, but also contextualize them within the larger discussions about specificity of place-based knowledge and its importance for understanding the history of the Soviet Union, Ukraine in the 20th century, and the current debates of decolonization and what it gives us in famine studies. My larger also idea is to help understand famine as very complicated, very complex event that doesn't emerge only in vacuum in one country in specific period, but also takes place in a specific political, social, and natural environment. And all of these elements are intertwined with each other at the same time. And these ideas I develop in my projects, and this set of questions I'm raising today in my presentation. So I'm asking, is there a place for environment in the history of famines? What was the impact of famine conditions on the environment, and specifically on animals, plants, and other non-human species? What does the history of animals and plants in famine reveal us about famines as historical events and a history of human-environmental relationship in such extreme social and survival crisis? And with this set of questions also certainly quite challenging to address, given that we are speaking about such enormous human catastrophe. So I am very conscious of that, and I'm also trying to think how we can produce a shared history of famine where we acknowledge the catastrophe for human, but also see this catastrophe as interconnected and mutually dependent to other species. How to study and talk about this, and what sources to use, what sources could help us to tell those stories. And also larger question, what does this focus tell us about the Soviet history and the history of famines globally? How this focus help us unpack the complex situation of man-made famines in Ukraine specifically. So my first focus today is history from the perspective of animals. As you could see, during famines in history, the deterioration of economic and environmental conditions in rural and urban areas had dramatic consequences for both people and animals. And this specific picture was taken by Austrian engineer Alexander Wienerberger in Kharkiv, back then the capital of Soviet Ukraine. And you could see that a horse is looking very starved, and but still the horse is working. So this situation and this very picture tells us a lot how animals experience a famine. They were still physically exploited while they were malnourished, and given the context of the Holodomor, grain was requisited from the household, so both people and their domestic animals didn't have enough food to sustain their lives. Also, I will focus on how pets experienced famines in Ukraine, and also famines outside of household, and I will look into the experiences of wild animals. So all of that helped us, I think, understand the broader consequences of famines and see them as something bigger, but like more overreaching rather than only a human catastrophe. So reporting on the situation in the countryside, in the sources we see how people were experiencing their struggles with the need to eat their cats and dogs. During the famine of 1932-33, one of the survivors wrote in the diary that, I quote, "I'm feeding a hunting dog. Once everything is expensive, but nobody needs her because of the lack of fodder. He, a collective farmer, asked me to take her, saying to me that they would eat it and would need to be killed it anyway." it's just one of the story. In the similar situation, local authorities just acknowledged that obviously all dogs and cats were eaten, and they were not visible even in the streets and in the countryside specifically. During the post-war famine, one of the eyewitness recalls that in his family, they also have the experience of eating dog. I quote, "One time we managed to catch a stray dog. We stopped it and ate it, and it provides us with food for several days." One of rare examples also tell us lots about personal experiences, how people were managed to cope with such practices and how they were explaining to themselves and to their neighbors and to other people who they've been in touch why they need to do so. And in personal testimonies and oral recollections followed 50 or 60 years after the famine, people are still coping with this emotion. So it tells a lot that those experiences were very challenging for them. And what about wild animals? Specifically, wild animals were also affected, and among them were gophers, groundhogs, hedgehogs, and other small wild species, which became crucial sources for human survival. In fact, those small animals were affected the most because people would go to the fields and would try to catch gophers. And in one of the personal testimonies, a survivor mentions that they would go to the field and catch around 10, 15 gophers at once. And in other testimony, another person tells that they would catch gophers with the help of whole family. So if we try to count the numbers, it's certainly not possible, but still we can at least understand the effects of human survival practices on other species. So speaking about the Soviet context, we also see here how those survival practices were interrelated with Soviet collectivization and Soviet collectivization projects when these pests, gophers, were eradicated from the collective farm fields to help grow bigger harvests. So this, these practices and Soviet politics were related to each other, and those very practices of the Soviet state were causing this famine. And what about plants? Speaking about plants, we see also how the different types of plants were essential for survival during the Soviet famines. The names of these plants come up very often in personal testimonies and in personal narratives of survival. Among them are mentioned burdock, which I mentioned in my first slide, dandelion, nordgrass, goosefoot, nettles, and many others, but these are the most often mentioned. And burdock was among the plants which was most interesting in the way how this plant became both a survival tool, but also a cause of famine poisoning, and I will tell a bit later about it. Also, famine food could be a fatal seed, and in this slide you could see how grain infected with pathogens of sclerotia became also poisonous for people who were trying to eat any grain they could find. And the infestation of grain with sclerotia became a common problem for grain crops, in particular rye. The local population and scientists called this disease as rishki or babi rishki. This disease was also known since medieval ages. Unfortunately, I do not have time to stop a lot, but during the famines in Ukraine, during the first Soviet famine, this disease was already known, and the discussions about it took place in the scientific context as well. according to estimations, around 0.2 of grain were infected with these pathogens in Ukraine. During the famine of 1932-33, again, this food poisonings by ergot fungus or sclerotia were found among the populations of famished regions in Ukraine. And this problem resulted in the discussions about how to clean grain from rishki and what instructions to provide the local populations. And in the number of local newspapers, we could find lots of instructions how to clean the grain and make them safe for consumption, human consumption, and for feeding the animals. For instance, a very common suggestion was to rinse grain with water and then take out this infected grain when they would pop up, or add in addition to water salt. But also we should acknowledge that, like, we are dealing here with famine when people are already starved, when they are malnourished, when they are weak, and in many cases they do not have enough physical power to do all of this work. And in many cases, people would not follow these rules and try to eat any grain that would found in the fields or other places. And in this slide, I would just like to point out that those discussions were very important, and for developing of medical discourse, how to treat famine diseases and how to study them. And one of the scholars that focused on treating ergotism as an issue was Ukrainian scholar, scientist Viktor Kohan-Yasny, who published a book about ergotism in the middle of the famine. In addition to ergotism, there was another common problem caused by another pathogen, Fusarium, and this was in fact very poisonous disease that was affecting grain in the fields. But given that people would go to the fields and try to collect any grain remaining there, this was also an issue. What those stories could tell us that famines, in fact, brought a lot of both survival issues for people, but also those very survival practices brought them in other issues. And I would like to provide an example of one specific case that happened in Dnipropetrovsk region in village Malala-Petikha during the early 30s famine. When one man went to Dnipro wetlands, he uncovered burdock plants and collected its seeds, and noticed that those seeds have a sweet taste. So in this case, he brought next time another peasant, and they would picked lots of burdock seeds and come back with them to their homes. And next day, all of their families would die, and only one of them, if I'm not mistaken, was able to survive. So here we see how this very poisonous seeds were used by people because of the lack of other sustaining food. What also important to acknowledge that Soviet authorities try to understand and try to follow the symptoms of food poisonings, and these symptoms of food poisonings come up not only in martyrology of famine famine victims in the sources, but also they come up in state authorities documents and paperwork, which followed those cases very detailedly. And in these cases, they notice that among the symptoms of poisoning by these plants were stomach pain, anxieties, severe vomiting, and they also noticed that illness would come up just in 3-4 days, and the end would be life-threatening and fatal. And in the previous case, which I mentioned about Malala Patiha, this case was followed by state security in organs, and they would follow this case and try to understand how this happened at all. What's also important to acknowledge about the survival practices during the Soviet famines, that those famines became an example of how the histories of human survival were related to histories of other non-human species. And taking such a critical overview towards the sources and towards the discussions about famines help us to understand the enormity of human sufferings. And in fact, this helps us to amplify the human experiences of survival and project people who survive these famines not only as victims, but survivors who made a lot of efforts to sustain their lives, sustain their families, and find lots of alternative sources of survival. This focus also helps us to reflect on other famines globally and to challenge this idea about modernity, about great projects of industrialization, which were happening at the same time while people have to go to the fields and for foraging or eat poisonous plant to survive. So from my perspective, we are here speaking not only about human survival practice, but also a history of multi-species catastrophe. And with this plant as burdock, I would like to end my presentation and hope that this would help us to start think critically about the challenges of human survival and the cost of human survival when we are speaking about famines globally. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to other presentations.
Thank you, Irina, for your wonderful presentation and for being here with us, as well for your time discipline. And now I would like to introduce our second speaker. Rūta Matematytė is a doctoral student at the Lithuanian Institute of History. Currently, she is writing her doctoral dissertation on the topic of migration of children to Soviet Lithuania, 1944-1960. History, memory, trauma. Her research on the German children of East Prussia was awarded the prize of the Department of National Minorities. She's actively engaged in the promotion of memory of the German children of East Prussia in Lithuania, and her main fields of research are migration children, memory and trauma, as well as the application of oral history. And she's going to present a paper titled "The Fight Against Typhus, the Duty of the Entire Soviet Society, the Case of East Prussian wolf children and Russian speaking in Soviet Lithuania." So Rūta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for this conference organizers. As was introduced, this paper is a part of my PhD thesis, also a part of my current fellowship at Nordost Institute in Lüneburg. The second half of 1944 was crucial change of a territory of a blue lands. In the case of East Prussia, it means significant political, social, and cultural transformation. Moreover, the end of Second World War was accompanied by famine and outbreaks of disease in Soviet-administered territories. Then the northern part of East Prussia became Kaliningrad, food shortages became evident. After the end of Second World War, food mostly could be found in the ruins of homes and bunkers. Only a working part of society could obtain a food ration cards, but the food received was not enough to share with the other family members. The unresolved hunger problem in Kaliningrad became increasingly severe and complicated. The participants of my interviews talk about eating animals, cats and dogs, hunting for mice and birds. The German historian and my colleague Christopher Spatz, who researched the fates of East Prussia children, emphasized that the hunger not only affected their physical health but also had a profound impact on their psychological well-being, causing the children to eventually stop communicating and speaking. Additionally, the famine altered and contributed to the breakdown and transformation of family relationship. Children became the primary organizers of food, making independent decisions and seeking and organizing food for their families. This marked the beginning of the first independent journeys by children between former East Prussia, which became Kaliningrad, and Lithuania. At the same time, in the second half of 1944, another migration intensified from the Soviet Union, including Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. In these republics, food shortages began, which eventually became a part of hunger problem that unfolded in Soviet Union between 1946 and 1948. During this period, the Baltic states, which became areas with food and settlements, gained particular importance. Soviet Lithuania played a significant role as a primary destination from children from both sides, from Kaliningrad and from Belarus, Ukraine, and Soviet Russia. Despite the Soviet occupation and the introduction of new norms and regulation, economic and social change, and the spontaneous migrants sought to reach the territory of Soviet Lithuania using freight trains, as you can see on the slides. Between 1946 and 1948, an increasing numbers of people entered Soviet Lithuania, and the migration issue didn't not by the Soviet bureaucratic institution. Therefore, I further discuss the control measures taken to manage migration. Looking at archival documents from the Soviet Lithuania, documents from the Ministry of Health and the Council of Ministers reveal previously little known control measures historiography about migration. One of the problems that emerged from 1946 onwards was related to the increasing numbers of typhus cases. Epidemiologists in the countries began to record more frequent cases of important typhus from the Soviet Union among the migrations flows to Lithuania. 1946, an additional decision was adopted concerning measures a fight against typhus. As more cases of important typhus were finding, greater attention was focused on transportation infrastructure, such as road and railway control. For example, decision was issued required to executive committees of Vilkaviškis district, which is located to the border with Kaliningrad, to instruct sanitary officials to inspect passenger health tickets at Pilviškis, Virbalis, and Vilkaviškis train station. Other railway stations in Soviet Lithuania were also required to sell tickets with sanitary certificates and install additional disinfection chambers and saunas at the stations. As a further correspondence and reports between the Ministry of Health, county chairperson, and inspectors, efforts to curb the typhus threat, the Soviet Lithuania often remained confident to formal exchange with a concrete actions such as station and saunas renovation and establishment of sanitary facilities not being adequately operational. This from 1947, in the Soviet documents, they more informed that typhus is related with migrations from both sides, from East Prussia became Kaliningrad, and from Soviet Russia and Belarus. And for this action, they are sent messages from local institution inform that these children cannot be accepted because they are sick, and it's dangerous for society, and for these children needs to return to them countries. For example, if children emigrate from Kaliningrad, they need to back again to them country. If children came from Belarus, Russia, they also need to return because it's dangerous for society. So, as I mentioned in my paper title, the typos was recognized as a duty for Soviet society and a fight. So it means if you want to be a part of Soviet society, you broke the rule if you accept German children in them home. As I mentioned in my slides, I did more than 50 interviews with East Prussian Germans, better known now as wolf children, and they recognize as a fear being Germans in Lithuania, but not a fear that Soviet seems them as having typos. So in them memory just left that a dangerous being German, but not having potentially disease. And here on the slides, you can see different periods that Soviet system see the problem of typos. The first period, they said it's until 1947, and this is not recognized as potentially dangerous with related with migration, but in the second period, as you can see, they saw a dangerous because of migration and relation with typos. As Lithuanian historian Arūnas Streikus point out, from 1948, Sovietization process occurred most intensively, radically altering the forms and norms of social, culture, and economical lives. Groups that attempt to avoid repression, hid illegally, or seen as potential dangerous, need to change. Close the orphanages for Jewish children in Vilnius, and from 1948 they saw that if you are German in Lithuania and it is dangerous for Soviets, and you need to be in Kaliningrad, or later in 1950s or 1951 you need to back in Germany and don't stay in Lithuania. The same process, you can see that trying to marginalize migration and related with typos after First World War. As a colleague, Lithuanian historian Tomas Balkelis point out that they are trying the same system, showing this migration after First World War as a dangerous, as a sick refugee in a public space. So the same trying to do the Soviet system after Second World War. But if we are looking for diaries, if we are looking from this times post-war society documents and what the Lithuanians wrote, they never, for example, mention that it's dangerous because of typos, except children. They always just focus on nationality of particularly being a German in Lithuania. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rute, for this very interesting paper. And now I would like to introduce our third speaker, Liliana Sirbu. She's currently completing master program in European Studies, Cultural Studies Department at Faculty of Letters of Bucharest University from Romania, Culture and Policy in European and International Context. She also obtained a degree in Pedagogy and Sociology Psychology Pedagogy faculty of Bucharest University from Romania and a degree in teacher training from Bucharest College. She completed 2 years of internship at the Euro-Atlantic Studies Institute, the Research Institute of History faculty of Bucharest University. And today she's going to present a paper entitled The Different Sides of Social Memory about Rationing Food in Ceausescu's Regime and Psychological Effects on Population. So, Liliana, the floor is yours and we are all ears.
First, I like to, it's okay, right? Yes? First, I would like to thanks to organizer that decided to invite me here, because this is a great opportunity for me. So far, I participate to national conferences, but never to international ones. The Romanian communism, the expression of Soviet domination, created unforgettable trauma using all abusive imaginable measures to have near absolute control over the population, integrated into the larger context of the most severe restrictions, famine, cold, darkness, in one word, poverty. Sorry. In one word, poverty, rationing food measure from President Ceausescu regime was active from 1981 until 1989. In my paper, in my presentation in this case, I intend to point out how different categories of citizens have different narratives based on social memory about the same reality. These collective memories can be about interpretations of facts, which could even explain the nostalgia about Ceausescu's epoch, while others have ongoing trauma reactions. The motivation for choosing this theme is my own experience of the traumatic life lived in communism. At the revolution, I was 17, sufficient to understand a life full of restrictions. Plus, I like the idea of interdisciplinarity, so I use my psychological knowledge in order to interpret the social memory aspects from communism. My other reason in choosing this theme is the lack of bibliography regarding the complexity of psychological effects of rationing food in my country, so I consider that my ideas expressed here would be useful in a better understanding of the topic. The frustration experienced in that period of life still have an echo in the minds and souls of Romanians and are the source of many mentalities and behaviors that will not disappear during life, but which can help explain many actual behaviors and even the current political decision. In 1988, the American political scientist with Polish origins, Zbigniew Brzezinski, stated that worldwide, communism was a historical tragedy because although it proposed a better and more human society, it produced mass oppression. It subjugated some of the brightest minds and most idealistic hearts, although it inspired some of the most awful crimes of this century. To speak about the phenomenon of hunger during the communist regime means synthetically to have as a reference point the excessive authoritarianism of dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. However, although it was frequently compared to Stalin, only he forced citizens to restrict the food, electricity, water, and to control even the reproduction. After the disappearance of Gheorghe Gheorghiu, considered the promoter of distancing from Moscow, President Ceausescu continued the policy of liberalization of the regime that ended suddenly in 1971, and this moment is very significant because it's associated with Ceausescu fascination about Asian model of power. He just came back from that time from Korea and China. In 1974, Romanian Communist Party program adopted the multilateral socialist society by 11 Congress. Thought officially regime comes in a deadlock, and the economic weakness become obvious into the 1980s. We might ask, how did the situation of rationing food appear in 1981? Although it does not fully justify the severity of the measures adopted, to know the succession of the events, it is useful in understanding the decision. A combination of interconnected economic, ideological, and psychological factors contributed to the aggravation of the situation, or leading to the agony of Romanian communism. But the determining factor, to which all others are subordinate, could be considered the inability of Ceausescu to adapt to the effects of geopolitical shocks of the change of East-West power paradigm, plus his lack of intention. The Romanian regime, caught in the game of the conflictual, financial, and political military East-West bloc wars, crossed two stages. The first stage began in the middle of 1960s due to the Romanian distancing policy towards Moscow and its external political orientation to the West. At this moment, Ceausescu's position was a rebellious actor of communist bloc, and in the second stage, which begins in 1983, the effects of geopolitical oil shocks, especially of the second one, affected the country against the background of the Romania external debt crisis. During this period, Ceausescu's regime image deteriorates, and he became the most demonized communist leader in the 90th decade. Even if sounds like a paradox, this evolution, a negative one, has a simple explication. It is the proof that the Occident had won both the informational and the imagological war, and that the communist vision ignored the effects of the geopolitical shocks of the change of East-West power. There are two concrete directions of applying of the rationing food measures. This was the effect of a decision of Ceausescu that is agreeing to pay the external debt quickly and completely, with the price of radically affecting the productivity of work and export, but the most serious consequences of this political decision were supported by the population. The government instituted legal coercive measures by Decree 306 in 1981 for those who purchased a larger quantity of consumer goods monthly than allowed, and sale on the cars was legislated. Under the cynical pretext of improving the quality of life, the ration nutrition program was introduced for the period 1982-1985, with an appendix about an ideal weight according to height, age, and gender. In fact, both of them were only methods to pay of saving to pay debts. Even if demagogic communist discourse for rationing food was formulated as a good one, as the road to hell is paved with good intention, as we say today, the impact was dramatic for most of the population. Famine from Ceausescu's regime has been a collective experience, but does not include everyone. So we could distinguish three categories of people from the criteria of how they face this reality. First category was communist officials from nomenclatura, but the rest of population is divided into categories. The one that developed adaptive behaviors, usually living in cities, and the population from villages, most affected one. Highly privileged communist officials were winners. They had full access to special stores, that means everything that had been refused to the general population. So if we refer to the psychological impact of this hierarchical position on the representative of the communist regime, is social success, both in self-confidence and in the feeling of superior status. The social success in the acceptance of the second category, usually living in cities, consists in the ability to create a system of social relations with the seller getting goods underhand. The problem is that this type of thinking was perpetuated after the revolution, affecting the moral dimension of people, being currently a defining feature of an important part of the population. The fact of being extricated from a difficulty, where a person is versatile, ingenious in finding solutions to solve any problem, refers to a negative meaning because this type of successful behavior is usually illegal. To achieve what you want, to succeed in life by all means, always appears as a reason for pride in everyday discussions, but is also a hidden sense of inappropriateness. This is how, from my point of view, the source of this behavior, essentially adaptive, are the practices of communism, and they explain the moral perverting of many people. The third category, constituted by the population from villages, was most disadvantaged by food rationing policy. There were not only lower quality basic food, but it could only be purchased with cars. In addition, families were allowed to fill gas bottles once every 6 months, so cooking was outdoor for all seasons by rudimentary means. Electricity interruptions were common and lasted more than in cities. Students from the villages were carrying out agricultural activities in weekends with their teachers, and all people, including intellectuals, were obliged to grow pigs for the state without having food for them, as their lands were now owned by the state. I consider that the psychological impact on the inhabitants of the village is due to the excessively humiliating daily life whereby they lost their self-confidence by radical changes in their own personhood and sense of self. We can assume that because of the resignation, they have limited their option by themselves, so some were professionally affected, and most could not evolve socially as they wished. For example, only very few have used the opportunities to set up a small business, even though after the revolution they had the necessary amounts to start them. Some of them have reached the wrong conclusion about themselves, that they should just accept that they are the lower class of the population, as a fact in accordance with the classification established by the communist regime. This psychological impact became a real challenge to overcome, so some people became much more ambitious and left the villages forever to move to the city or to leave the country. Sorry. The social climate of this epoch can be recreated via the letters intercepted by the Romanian security, the fundamental institution of the communist regime, which monitored the entire Romanian society since 1948. The topics that appear frequently in the correspondence of Romanians concern electric current interruptions and coal houses, but the subject that appears most often refers to the drama of the lack of food. Coexisting with the other shortcomings, the hunger during the Ceausescu regime becomes the dominant obsession of the daily life, and its visible expression is the existence of long food lines. Standing in line for food is not only the symptom of social pathology that simulates social inequality, but it is also a psychological trauma. Although the existence of line is currently regarded as a disadvantage, in communism it was even a satisfactory situation, as it means, at least theoretically, the hope of purchasing food. Revolving is the fact that these cars did not guarantee obtaining the products they provided. The standing in line is equivalent with only the attempt to obtain them. What is certain, in this case, is that the daily test of repeated humiliation, a depersonalization occasion, in accordance with the communist doctrine. The line of food, in the form created by Ceausescu, represented a threat to human dignity, a lesson of submission, in my opinion, and essentially an act of dehumanization. However, the newspapers of the time describe an utopian society with fabulous achievements in all economic areas, illustrating the deep discrepancy between propaganda and reality. Citizens were presented with reasons for pride and are given examples of model citizens employed in the effort to build a model socialist society. For example, Scânteia, the one that is exposed now, Flacăra means flame. Again, Flacăra. This is Free Romania. Sounds like an irony. And kind of magazine or something. All those are part of my archive family library, so we kept them just to remember that very bad period of our lives. And now I finally found reason to use them for a good purpose, I hope. Why does Romanian communism have the hardest face? It is because of the existence of the cult of the president's personality and the mentality of the population to bear any living conditions, as well as the exercise of the role of security, which created permanent fear among the population and generalized paranoia. Why are the psychological effects of food deprivation felt throughout entire life? Food is one of the primordial needs for life, based on the lower part of Maslow's pyramid of needs. What the communist regime had done affected exactly the primary needs of human beings. Counted also the long period of exercise of this deprivation, the period when the severity of the regime had reached its peak. However, in my opinion, the effects of the trauma of the communist period have a permanent presence, but what I call myself the symptom of the full refrigerator, that you must have it daily in order not to affect your emotional balance or the idea of stability of life. If it's empty and the situation is not fixed quickly, anxiety and panic occur. How do we explain nostalgia after communism? Because of focusing public discourse on the image of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife, people can ignore the profound causes of the economic and ideological failure of communism. part of today's society continues to have the nostalgia of communism as they confront with difficulties of capitalist society. The habit of living in communism is assimilated with the stability of life, in contrast to the effort to adapt to a new society marked by hazard and insecurity. Also, a paradoxical situation of communist nostalgia appeared in full communism, as the terror of Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, former president, period was forgotten and people preferred to remember only the positive things regarding the abundance of food, proving a social amnesia in action. The fact is relevant for a normal tendency of the people to remember in a selective way what amaze, what is out of patterns, both in a positive or negative way. I consider that people become dependent on an oppressive system since, from a psychological point of view, it is the same time of relationship that develops individually between an abusive and an abused person, between the aggressor and the victim, a form of domination and submission, extended in this case to a social scale specific to dictatorship. There are people with this personality structure who still need a paternal figure that imposes and punishes when necessary, being an attitude specific to the extension of childhood throughout life. Conclusions. What is the source of such a different memories about the communist regime? It is the fact that people subjectively react based on their own life experiences. If they were part of the regime's favorites, the regime was very good. If not, it was a bad one, and that leads to the conclusion of moral alienation or only selfishness and their own life count. The fact of extricate oneself from a difficulty, which was an adaptive behavior of resistance and survive, often illegal, represented the source of the development of corruptions at the generalized level in society, practiced in communism and perpetuated after 1989 in different forms. When hunger and poverty are present for a long time in life, they create a certain personality structure, and their effects are still visible in people's characters and decisions. Even after 30 years from revolution, one of the reasons why Romanian society is so divided. In addition, this is demonstrated by the political options for social democratic ideologies, relevant options for limiting people's expectation to the minimum but sure life level. And yet, the hunger lived during the communist regime, although it is part of the recent history of Romania, is an abstract reality for young generation living in capitalism. That is why the recall and condemnation of communism and its horrors are a moral duty, as well as the need to learn from this experience that we all want it irreversible. Thank you for your attention. And this is my bibliography.
Thank you, Liliana, for your presentation. And now I would like to introduce our fourth panelist, Katarzyna Stańczak-Wiślicz, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences and a member of a research team, Women's Archives, Archiwum Kobiet. Her research interests range from the gender and women's history in post-war Poland to the history of popular culture and popular discourse analysis. She's the author of the book Real Life Stories, Confession Narratives in Polish Popular Women's Magazines in 20th Century, published in Warsaw 2010, and co-author of the book Women in Poland 1945-1989, Modernity, Equality, Communism, published in 2020. She's currently working on a project on personal narratives in Poland during the crisis of the 1980s, and her today talk will also refer to the very last decade of Polish People's Republic, as the title of her paper is Remembering the Famine, Food Shortages, Food Rationing in Private Narratives of the Crisis of the 1980s in Poland. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me. And as you said, my today's presentation is a part of a bigger project which is based on the analysis of personal documents, diaries and memoirs written by so-called ordinary people and submitted to memoir writing competitions during the Polish crisis of the 1980s. For the purpose of today's presentation, I'm looking at the image of food shortages and at the image of famine from two perspectives. Firstly, I forgot. I forgot about the presentation. Firstly, the pictures of empty hooks in butcher shops, people waiting in long lines for foodstuff, hunger marches of women with small children, slogans such as "We want bread," are in the center of the collective memory of the crisis of the 1980s in Poland. And this memory was mediated mostly by visual texts, by visual representation, which were reproduced by media. The next perspective, I'm asking how the collective memory of the famine, or maybe a famine memory of the Second World War, influenced the ways in which individuals, I mean memoirists, constructed their narratives of the crisis. I argue that the image of food deprivation and hunger, it was one of the most significant factors that shaped the emotional climate of the time, and it also provided individuals with narrative patterns to describe the crisis situation. In my research, the key concept for my research are, firstly, this is the crisis. Although I really like the definition by Antonio Gramsci, who said that the crisis, this is the period when the old is dying and the new still can't be born. I refer mostly to the definitions by Reinhard Koselleck and Ruth Levitas, who emphasized this aspect of transition and of change. So I understand the crisis as a historically immanent transitional phase when the intense changes took place and everyday life became unstable. People were forced to choose between adapting to the existing conditions and participating actively in their transformation. So the crisis, this is a future-oriented category. It was also a period when people experienced a kind of crisis of language, when people are looking for new terms, for new categories to understand and to describe the reality. Going back to my sources, to my main sources, at last, several hundred of memoir competitions were organized in Poland during the 1980s. Memoir competitions, it's really very particular phenomenon for Poland. Most of these competitions did not refer to the crisis situation. Although I believe that the authors who contributed to these competitions were in some way responding to the political situation, my research focuses on diaries and memoirs that had been submitted to competitions that addressed the crisis situation. When, for example, the memoir, when people were asked to write about their experience of crisis, about their coping strategies, about, for example, their memoirs, about their memory of August 1980, their memoir of strikes, and so on. Since I'm interested in how the crisis was understood on an ongoing basis, the last competition I'm considering was organized by Carta Center in 1991, and the first one in November 1980 by the Gdańsk office of the Polish Sociological Association. These memoir writing competitions were organized both by official Polish media and by decent and foreign media, like Radio Free Europe and Kultura from Paris. And as I said before, I focus on these memoirs which were written by so-called ordinary people. I'm not analyzing memoirs written by prominent dissidents and also by prominent party members. They are quite well analyzed as far. Of course, my sources are not complete and not representative for Polish society. Their authors were better educated than average. And most of them came from large cities, from Warsaw, Poznań, Kraków, Wrocław, Gdańsk. There was a similar number of women and men among the authors, with a slight advantage in favor of men. Most of the authors were on the side of the opposition, but I've also found a few texts written by supporters of the communist regime. And what is particularly striking in these memoirs is the relationship between the common, the political, and the private, or the everyday. The memoirists, although very few of them were active participants in the political events they described, were aware that they were witnessing the so-called great history. And they very often use this phrase, great history, always in capital letters. They therefore adopted the strategy of a witness or of a chronicler who intentionally produced testimonies of the time, who intentionally produced historical sources. Almost all of them mentioned the same set of facts and reported political events in chronological order. So they were strikes in the Tri-City in August 1980, the pacification of the strike in the Wujek coal mine in December 1981, so-called Bydgoszcz events, the murder of Jerzy Popiełuszko, the visit of the Pope John Paul II, and of course the declarations of the martial law. They also mentioned some local events, but described them as less important. Regardless of their gender, they focused on the so-called great history, on this political history. I argue that by choosing this strategy, this documentary narrative strategy, they accepted a hierarchy of importance that privileged the common, the political, over the private, the society, or the nation, because they used rather the term nation, also in capital letter, over the individual. It does not mean, however, that they completely ignored the sphere of everyday life. And here is this paradox. Although they defined it as unimportant and trivial, they described very detailedly their daily routines, shopping, commuting, but above all, cooking and eating. And they emphasized how everyday life was changing. Women and men alike mentioned the changing prices of foodstuff, the amount of food ration cards. They described their experiences of standing in long lines. And in other words, they showed how uncommon became every day. They explained, because they felt obliged to explain why they were writing about so trivial things when the great history was happening. So they explained their decision of writing about everyday things by presenting them as evidence of the injustice of the communist system in general, or of the evil intentions of the communist authorities who, during the 80s, deliberately starved people to death. In this way, the narrative of everyday life was framed by the victim-perpetrator discourse. And the image of food shortages was perfect for this purpose. In the times of economic, political, and social crisis, food, and especially food shortages, occupy important position in the public debate and in collective imagination. It can be said that food and consumption are lens through which individuals understand, present, and try to creatively respond to the crisis. During the Polish crisis of the 1980s, images of food shortages worked as a manifestation of collective emotions, primarily fear and anxiety. Hunger, starvation, and the export of food to the Soviet Union were common themes of rumors, gossips, ephemeral political poetry, and jokes. In the public discourse, which was shaped both by official media and also by samizdat and by decent media, like, for example, Radio Free Europe, the threat of malnutrition, not of hunger, but of malnutrition, became a metaphor for the crisis situation. In this way, food, cooking, and eating, which in normal times are invisible as ordinary and important everyday practices, became visible. The official media kept reporting about the grain and potato harvest. Information on livestock and meat supplies came to the forefront of the news. To calm down emotions, official media emphasized the government's efforts to provide foodstuff, for example, by importing from other countries of the bloc. It was especially visible after the introduction of the martial law. Nevertheless, they had to admit that food shortages were real. In 1981, 1982, when the food shortages were the greatest, Polish media diagnosed the situation of a biological threat to the nation. Physicians interviewed by radio and by general interest magazines and women's magazines as well appealed to save meat and animal fats for children, youth, and pregnant women. Media discourse on the risk of hunger, as well as informal information flows, affected the ways in which the authors of the competition diaries and memoirs described their everyday experiences of crisis. They were simply writing down information on rising food prices, and it's interesting, for example, here there are pages from the diary of Anna Krzyżanowska, who during the 80s was a young married woman with 2 small children, and her diary is really very long. It's about 3 very big copybooks, notebooks, and she put down the prices of the foodstuff, and she also included into her diary this rationing coupon for meat. Sorry, so I got lost. The diarists were writing down information on rising food prices, on the rationing system, but at the same time, they avoided writing about their own feelings and emotions. It seems that they used the narrative of food deprivation as a metaphor to describe their feelings of anxiety, of fear, and of being uncertain. When writing about food scarcity, the diarists were also looking for adequate vocabulary. The optimistic emotional regime of the post-war era defined extreme food shortages and hunger as experiences of the capitalist past and also of the Second World War. food shortages and the famine were discursively located in the past. Polish famine memory, which I understand, sorry, I will go back to this slide, okay. So I understand famine memory, and I adopt this definition from the research on the so-called Dutch hunger winter. So the famine memory, this is a repertoire of images and narrative structures which are used for the remembrance of episodes of hunger. And in Polish case, in fact, this famine memory consists of very few images. And these very few images were like food rationing, black market, malnutrition of children, and so on. This Polish famine memory was really limited to very few images. However, the famine memory was also used by and mediated by politicians and by media in the process of post-war national identity production, which based on the images of war losses and sufferings. However, they belong to the past. This famine memory had a double potential. On the one hand, it influenced state food policy and the public debate on food security. Food abundance became one of the most important elements of the communists' promise of a good life. At the same time, the memory of food shortages and the threat of, maybe not starvation, but the threat of shortages were used in the counter-discourse that was developed in times of crisis and turmoils. For example, during the protests and strikes, such as in 1956, they were articulated demands for bread. During the crisis of the 1980s, when Poland really experienced food shortages, these images dominated public imagination. The authors of the competition memoirs record the memory of historical periods of extreme food shortages to describe the current situation. Even if they were born after 1945, the association with the period of the German occupation was an obvious point of reference for them. They referred to the traumatic memory of the war famine, but they didn't describe it in details. It was only a category, not explained. They mentioned both their private family stories and also the main narrative about Polish sufferings during the war. First of all, they identified the food shortages as a clear manifestation of the life-threatening disaster compared to war situation. For example, Józefa Radzymińska, a Warsaw-based writer and journalist, described long lines for bread and meat exactly as during the occupation. Moreover, she interpreted food shortages as a purposive action of the communist government, which could be compared only to the repressive policies of the Nazis. To express the feeling of extreme anxiety, the memoirists argued that the situation was even worse than during the war. Radzymińska, who remembered the war and occupation, used well-known narratives about starvation as a metaphor of her feelings, anxiety, and fear of possible Soviet intervention. She wrote about feeling dizzy because of the hunger, about being too weak to do anything. At the same time, she reported the gossips about transports of foodstuff, mainly meat and animal fats, to the Soviet Union. I think that the alarmist notations about starving, which in fact meant insufficiency of meat, animal fats and diarrhea, should be read as a manifestation of subjective sense of deprivation and of the individual and collective feeling of anxiety. Actually, despite the significant decline in meat consumption during the 80s, physicians and dietitians did not confirm the reports on the threat of hunger. Even those who contributed to the underground media identified the situation of malnutrition, but not of famine, and they still presented the malnutrition as a consequence of Polish bad eating habits. The memoirists used the historical metaphors related to food and starving also to describe the official policy of the communist authorities, and on the other hand, also to describe the coping strategies developed by individuals. They saw the food rationing introduced in 1981 as a clear reference to the period of Nazi occupation. Despite the official propaganda's claims that it was to improve supply, they interpreted it in terms of catastrophe. Some of the authors even included food stamps into their memoirs, presenting them as a historical source for the times of catastrophe. When writing about the black market, they recalled the war experiences of their family members, or they referred to the images which were present in the text of popular culture, primarily films and TV series, so to the mediated famine memory. And they very often referred to this scene from the movie which was presented during the previous panel. Finishing, food shortages, eating practices, although were presented as trivial and unimportant, occupied an important place in the competition memoirs written during the 1980s. The memoirists articulated a sense of deprivation and linked it directly to the political situation. In this way, the competition memoirs can be perceived as a manifestation of the politicization of everyday life, as said Małgorzata Mazurek. Food shortages, famine associated with the wartime sufferings, threatened the whole nation, not just individuals. And coming to the very short conclusions, the collective memory of famine has become central element of the narratives of everyday experiences of crisis. People were not writing, for example, about rationing shoes or soap, but they focused on the rationing on food and only on the food shortages. The repertoire of narratives and images that constituted famine memory were narrowed to the basic figures of starving mothers and children and wartime food rationing. And the collective memory of the war famine provided individuals with narrative tropes for the articulation of their feelings of anxiety and uncertainty, and in this way helped them to understand the current crisis and place it in the continuum of Polish history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katarzyna, for this wonderful paper. And it seems that we have had 4 very time-disciplined panelists during this session, so thank you for that as well. And to summarize a little bit all presentations, I think that this session may be a good continuation of our previous panel and all 4 papers. We saw very different social actors, namely lonely, abandoned children, wolf children, often war orphans, the citizens of 2 communist states who reacted in a different ways to top-down food rationing and associated fear of potential hunger, and finally the Ukrainian population that faced with the horrors of real famine activated survival strategies that transcended cultural taboos. I think that what emerges from the survival strategies described in all these articles or papers is the varied and differently applied agency of all these actors seen from below, from the perspective of everyday life practices. And I found all these papers very interesting, and they generated many reflections and questions, but perhaps I will address them a little bit later if there will be time to do so. And now I would like to give floor to our audience and open the discussion. We have around half an hour, so it's a lot of time. So if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to share them now. Can we ask for the mic? Professor Kopczyński.
Thank you very much. For a short comment to the first paper by Irina, I know a professor of biology from Łódź, Łukasz Łuczaj, who is an owner of a former peasant cottage and a meadow and a forest in southeastern Poland, and he is organizing there holiday 2 weeks courses, survive on a meadow and survive in a forest. And he, for money, instructs his clients how to use those quasi-foods that were quite popular in the early modern period in the 19th century, because his research is concentrated on those semi-foods or hunger foods that were used in the situation of crisis. And the sources of food are quite similar to them, to those Irina told us about. As far as the Polish situation, probably also the Romanian, I suppose that in the 1980s you used the term famine, but it was a famine without a famine, because it was quite subjective. It's quite subjective famine, and there were anthropological research of 19-year-old conscripts to the Polish army. 10% of conscripts were measured, and they looked, the anthropologists from Wrocław, they looked for any signs of malnutrition, and they were not able to find, although they found a really big social stratification. All social categories, beginning from children of rural, farmers, individual farmers, to inhabitants of big cities. All of them grew taller and taller, but the difference between them never diminished under socialism. Only after the transformation in capitalism, these social differences became much more narrow. This year there was the last research, and we have a 10% sample of conscripts, but I don't have the final results now. I will have in a few months, so we will see if Polish capitalism breeds inequality or quite contrary. So the situation in the 1980s was the most dangerous for the ruling elite, because it was a situation like before the French Revolution. It was a subjective famine without a true famine. A very, very, very dangerous situation. I suppose that you can use the notion of moral economy that was coined by Edward Thompson. He wrote about England in the 18th century, but this concept was also used for Poland just after the Second World War, and it explains this quoted in your paper, those opinions that I remember this. It's against dignity or something like that. That there is a famine, but in fact, from those research by anthropologists, it was proved that the family ties were quite good shields that enabled young people to survive without malnutrition at even in the 1980s. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kopczynski. And Katarzyna, would you like to refer to that, or?
So maybe I will refer. Thank you so much. I really like this category, famine without famine, because this is exactly what I can see in this competition memoirs. I'm absolutely sure that Józefa Radzymińska, who wrote about feeling dizzy of hunger, she wasn't hungry. By the way, she described also her birthday party, which was full of very luxurious food stuff. So I'm sure she was not starving, but she described it as starving, as famine, because it was this subjective famine, which I totally agree, it was very dangerous, because it really affected this collective emotional climate. People were more talking about starving than starving in fact. And I saw also the analysis produced by nutritionists from the Instytut Żywności i Żywienia, Institute of Food and Nutrition. And they really show that there was not starving, not even serious malnutrition. Yes, this family ties and other coping strategies, they really helped people to survive without malnutrition. And thank you for this moral economy. I think it will really help me to interpret this paradox, this famine without famine.
Not to be too optimistic. Because we were probably not very hungry. But we lost a lot of time in all those lines, all those children of socialism.
Yes.
So we lost a lot of times. I would be maybe more wise, read much more books than I read without those lines for
in my
everything.
childhood.
Yes.
Yes. So thank you so much. Especially for this famine without famine, I really like it.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if we have any questions from, yes, so.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank for all excellent speaks, especially for cross-species perspective in first speech. And I have a short commentary for last one. I think that in this research, perspective of Inga Iwasiów will be useful because this research writes about central civilian gender during the First and Second World Wars. And Iwasiów writes that First and Second World Wars, the front of these wars is a private space, a daily fight of survived, and it's especially a war of women as deprived consumers who cannot provide their families with nutritious food. And maybe that's why war's narrative patterns are useful for diarists in 80s. Thank you very much, and I'm very sorry for my English, which isn't fluently.
Okay. So I will answer also in not very fluent English. Thank you very much. I think that this is a good idea to look into Inga Iwasiu's books. I've read her Bambino, for example, and I think this is excellent. And this perspective of literary texts, which can shed some light on the gendered practices, yes, and how the gendered experiences is really very important, and I think I will certainly include it. I wasn't thinking about it, but now I will think so. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we have one question addressed to Liliana that was asked by our online participant, Professor Marcela Zalajan. So I'm going to read it. The question is how to explain in recent years the quite frequent promotion by many Romanian televisions of the Romanian foreign policy during the time of the Nicolae Ceausescu. Can it still be considered nostalgia for that period? Would you like to answer?
I think our televisions usually have news about Nicolae Ceausescu's epoch, but this thing is especially take place in January when he was born. So a lot of people just go to put flowers and remember his memory. But if you ask myself, it's about only reduced number of people that really exposed themselves and risk to be interpreted having these options. But overall society is impossible to quantify exactly the number of citizens that nowadays just would replace, if they could, actual regime in capitalism with the previous one. And I was thinking about old generations. Most percentage from them usually are nostalgic about that regime, but is obviously associated with their youth, considered that the best period in their life. But what I noticed by myself during last years, as organizer just suggests, I found out a paradoxical thing. A lot of persons from young generation that are born after revolution just insist to say that would be good if that regime will get back. And I was very surprised all the time. How come you didn't live one day in that period of time? How you could appreciate and really denied actual society? I think the explanation is the influence of their family. Plus, with difficulties to succeed in a professional way in this capitalist society. So from combination of those two reasons, they have exactly the same perception and eventually same political options for when they get when they want to vote.
Okay, thank you.
Like old generations, I meant, sorry.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting panel, and thank you to all the panelists. And I have a question to last two to works. I feel that in the culture of the period of 1980s, 1990s, the strategy of dealing of the shortages which is most visible in culture is by humor. In Poland, I don't know how it's in Romania. It would be interesting to know. And is it also visible in the sources from the ordinary people? Is it a strategy which is more social, or we also see it in the more intimate sources that people share anecdotes about how to beat the cues, how to beat the system with humor?
I think that maybe in the memoirs sent to the different competitions, it will be more visible. Because I'm analyzing only the memoirs which were submitted to the competitions which were called, for example, My August 1980, My Crisis Year, and so on and so on. And because people were expected, because they got some instructions how to write these memoirs, they were expected to write about great events. They tried to avoid writing about their private emotions, feelings, and about what they were doing. But somehow you can find this. Maybe it was not their intention, but in this diary, which, for example, was on my presentation, it was written by a young woman from Warsaw who was a mother of 2 small children. And although she wrote down what she heard in the Radio Free Europe and what she heard in official television, and it was quite boring because she was simply writing what she heard. But except this, she also was writing how she tried, for example, to buy shoes for her daughter, and how, for example, she changed the shoes with her friend because she got not the proper number of shoes, and so on and so on. So people sometimes write about their strategies, how to cope, how to face the crisis, and they were more eager to write how they politically thought, because they were very proud of listening to Radio Free Europe, for example, and of taking part in the patriotic demonstrations and so on. So they were writing about it. And I'm sure that in other memoirs, because I've also analyzed only few memoirs which were very long, and only a part of them were sent to the competitions. But I found that there were really huge. Some people started writing in late 70s, and they kept writing through the 80s. So in these memoirs, there is much more to find. And yes, this is a kind of culture, of a very specific culture of the 80s. And that's why I think these memoirs, although I'm of course aware of all the limitations of my source, I think this is a very good source to examine the emotional climate and also the new emotional regime which emerged during the 80s in Poland. Yes, this specific culture, it can be seen, can be traced in the memoirs and also in the letters to the editors, to the magazines. Thank you.
Okay, and Liliana, would you like to also refer?
Yes, about the question that organizer...
Maybe you should just keep it closer. Yeah.
I still have another idea, plus in comparison with what I already answered to organizer Evelina Spack. How I explain the practice of televisions to remember periodically the image of Ceausescu. Like this was your question?
It's not. It was Marcela Salajan. This is the question from the online audience. So, yeah.
How to explain in the recent years the quite frequent promotion by many Romanian televisions of the Romanian foreign policy during the time of the Nicolae Ceausescu? Can it still be considered nostalgia for that period? I think nostalgia is already a fact, known by everyone, but I have an idea about their motivation of those televisions. They promote and remember the image of Ceausescu because they try to influence part of the population and to manipulate them in a subtle way, eventually for the next political options when they will go to future elections. That's why I think that happens.
Okay, thank you. And do we have any questions? Okay.
Well, sorry. I have two questions, one for Ruta and one for Katarzyna. And thank you all for the very interesting presentations. And Ruta, I was thinking about those wolf children. I mean, those are like tragic stories. And I was wondering, when you say that they were perceived as a threat to the Lithuanian population and also people in Kaliningrad because of typhus, and what did people in Lithuania and also the government in Lithuania did to how they treated the children? Were there like programs to put them into quarantine, for example, to keep typhus away from the rest of the population, or were there programs to bring them back to Germany? I don't know. So I'm very curious. And Katarzyna, I think those diaries are very interesting, and I learned so much. And I was wondering if you said in your paper, in your talk, you said that communism made this promise for a good life. And do you find anything in these diaries that this promise of good life was so much disappointed during this food shortages that it maybe contributed to political change? And maybe did people describe how they kind of, got into conflict with this political system, not only the Soviet Union, which seemed to be clear, but also the Polish political system? Yeah, so thank you.
Who wants first? Maybe Ruth.
Thank you so much for the question, and I'm totally agree with it's a very tragical story, and unfortunately this story was forgotten around 45, 50 years because of Cold War, because in this narrative cannot also exist in Soviet during the Soviet time, and my cases, which I present today, I could say it's a quite new perspective of East Prussian German children, well known as the wolf children, because mostly researcher doesn't look from the perspective what Soviet did and how Soviet react to the massive migration to the Soviet Lithuania. It was a huge numbers. I could mention it was around 5,000 or 6,000 children who entered to Soviet Lithuanian territory, as the same or much bigger wave was from Soviet Russia or Belarus or Ukraine, which also entered to the Soviet Lithuania. And for me was also a particularly interesting answer that there was no programs, there is no quarantines. The only solution, what Soviet suggests, is return them to Kaliningrad. There was no thinking about how we could help, because for example, children institution which was responsible for, in general, in children beggar question, they was full. And they cannot accept much more sick or imagine that they are sick people. And for example, in these cases, what does it mean back to Kaliningrad? For them, for children, it means a death, because it was a small chance to find a food, and for this, them means death. So children left dying mothers to the possibility to enter to Soviet Lithuania, but this narrative never be in them testimonies. They never mention that we are scared because we are sick, we are scared because we are Germans. And this perspective affect historiography, and what I'm doing in my PhD thesis, I just trying to put above perspective, Soviet perspective, how we look, how the children feel in the Soviet Lithuania, and how Lithuanian guardians look at them. And Lithuanians, of course, particularly in the villages, they are trying to save the children, they give a bread, but also this is also very I could say sad story, because when they accept children in villages, particularly it means, for example, the children usually don't went to school, they have no educational, they was just a worker of farmers.
Thank you. Katarzyna?
Thank you. It's really interesting question about this promise of good life, because some of memoirists they refer to this promise of good life, and it was an irony. But in these memoirs, which were authored by working class people, mostly by working class women, it is visible that they felt a kind of feeling uncertain, about feeling disappointed, because they were promised to have quite a good life, to have enough food. It means enough meat, mostly enough meat. And then something happened, and they felt that the authorities didn't fulfill their promises. And I have one particularly interesting memoir I've read. The author came from the small city in southern Poland, and she was she was from the working class family, and she also was a worker herself. She also worked in the meat factory, and she described the practice of stealing the meat from her workplace as a strategy, of a coping strategy, survival strategy. And she directly said that because they did not fulfill their promise of a good life, she had to steal this meat. She had to be a thief or something like this. And yes, of course, it was Soviet Union which was to blame for the food shortages, for this very poor situation in Poland, but also Polish authorities. And this feeling of disappointment is quite visible in the memoirs.
Thank you. And so as I also have some questions, so I would like to ask them right now. And we have still few minutes. So first question I would like to address to Ruta, because I also find your PhD project very fascinating, and I hope that you will do that wonderfully. And I'm sure, but I have a question concerning these children and how did the period of living in the forest or relying on oneself and the related need to activate not only a survival strategy, I think, but maybe most of all primal survival instincts at such a young age affected their future life, their adulthood. What come out from your oral sources, as you said that you are also interested in that field of research, and yeah, because as far as I know, during the USSR period, these children were forced to hide their identity, and this might cause trauma. So I would like to ask you about that. And yes, and I have also a question to Katarzyna. I don't know if it is a wise question, maybe not, but it came to my mind. So to what extent can the narratives emerging from memories be considered an element of unprocessed, inherited trauma? I know that trauma is overused, but overused term, but perhaps. And so to what extent they can be considered as a sort of inherited or unprocessed trauma of second, but also, as we have heard today, maybe First World War trauma, and were they just a strategy to communicate, these narratives, were they just strategy to communicate their needs, or maybe to some extent some cautious patterns of reaction towards uncertainty and fear of hunger? So yeah, these are my questions. Who would like to answer first? Yeah. In order, okay.
Okay, so in general, I just want to a little back and to say that we use a term evolved children, and of course it's necessary to say that this term don't have nothing with the reality that children experience in life. Also, we can look retrospectively and say maybe children live in nature, and this term could be very close to them experience, but this term came from Germany after 90s. One German filmmaker, Eberhard Fechner, created a film about them fate, and this term became more and more popular, and at least the hunger children, East Prussian Germans call themselves as the wolf children. But in our Lithuanian collective memory, these children better known as the little Germans, or in German Kleindeutsch. So back to your first question about forest and nature, of course, the instincts of surviving at that time working very strong, and they are so much focused about them experience, and they don't even think about other family members, about the closest members, mothers, sisters or grandparents. We just focus about asking themselves how I could survive, what I can do. And for example, I asked, it was more children as you which was hunger, and they usually say that I was hungry. They don't see what was around them. In them narratives, they of course narrate this, that they are trying to survive in the natures, and it is of course a little bit affect, I think so, them memory, because they mention that they cannot, when now they are 80s or 90s, and when they are telling a story, they said, I cannot remember it is happened really in the nature or I dream. And for them, it is sometimes memories are mixed. What's happened, for example, particularly in the natures, and how it affect them life. I could say from my personal perspective, because when I start this research, starting with my aunt, this is a wolf children, and she was the youngest of this fate, and for her experience, I know that she forgotten German language. It is, of course, affect her identity, and she cannot, until now, she's this year celebrate 80s, and she cannot say who I am actually. She said I'm between Lithuania and between Germany. Of course, and other wolf children was strongly affected, and the sadness moment of his story, I could say that this trauma left not reflected, because this trauma they addressed to the Germany, not Lithuania. And after 90s, they think if they will establish organization and do some actions, maybe they will get attention from Germany, and they will accept them as victims of war, victims of famine, victims of migration, and Germany accept them very skeptical, because during that time, especially German bureaucrats doesn't know too much what's happened after Second World War, and particularly about a group which came to Lithuania. And for them, it's a very sad question when they ask why you migrate not to Germany during the Second World War, end of the Second War, why became in your life Lithuania? And them, when they faced a skeptical German perspective, when they try to get back nationality, German nationality, they faced very bad way, and for them, they just until now say that we in Germany, we feel that nobody needs us. No matter how Lithuania in the public sphere it is doing, for example, a lot of films, documentaries, novels, a lot of things came at the moment, particularly in the Ukraine war. This topic became very, very popular now in Lithuania. I could say became more popular, but they are also looking more what German do for them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm not able now to answer this question, but this is the very good effect of this conference, because it makes me thinking more. But
we are happy to hear that.
Yes, I've traced, there are really no mentions about, for example, the First World War, only the Second World War. Maybe it is something is in this unprocessed trauma, but I think that the memoirists, they mostly referred to this famine memory, which was somehow produced during the parallel period. They refer to the images which were mediated by literature, by movies, by journalists, and I think it was somehow like produced collective memory of the war. And the Second World War, it was this basic situation, most threatening, yes, the danger of death and so on. This was the worst situation. So they compared the crisis to the worst situation they could remember or not remember, but they refer to this produced collective memory. But really your question makes me thinking more about it.
I'm really happy. Okay, so do you have any questions, comments? I know it's late, so I would like to thank all panelists for their wonderful papers and all of you for your questions and comments, still so stimulating despite the late time. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the last panel panel we planned for today. So have a nice evening and hopefully see you tomorrow. Thank you.